Hello everybody. Thanks for joining. This is going to be a talk to introduce a little bit about my research and more broadly the field of AI regulation. And it's funny because we talk about AI and regulation, yet we don't really understand much about any of those things, or there is, let me put it this way, a fair amount of confusion around both of these things. So I'm hoping to get to the bottom of some of those things, and I'm hoping that I can show you a couple of entry points whereby you can approach this field from your various disciplines or stakeholder backgrounds, depending on whether you're in academia, in government, in the civil society, or industry. Okay, if it works, but it doesn't work, I'm sorry, somehow. Okay, so does it work? Okay, I'm sorry for that. All right, so like I said, because of the confusion around what it is to regulate or regulation itself, I will talk a little bit about that one. Then I will zoom in on a couple of issues that are specific to AI or technological innovation more generally. And then I will talk a little bit about implementation challenges, because those are very interesting, especially from an industry perspective. Okay, so the title says that regulation is a true team effort. So let me start by talking a little bit about what it means, team. So we have heard that word, yeah, teamwork, I think a little too often, as well as some of us are, I'm sure, annoyed even with the term. But did you know that team is not just a word, but it can only be an acronym? Like you can build acronyms of anything, you would argue. And there are several acronyms that you could build from team, but this is one, and that is one of the more well-known ones. Together, everyone achieves more. So that's what team stands for, really, at least in one interpretation. And so I would like you to get that thought into your heads right now, because this is something that we will get back to, and hoping to show you how you can contribute to this field and how it is really important that we all work together in order to crack some very current problems in this field. Okay, so then let's introduce your teammates, because, well, who is in this team that has to work together? And let's do that by looking at this question: should AI be regulated? So you can ask different talks about this and you will get very different answers. So if you ask some law people, then you will get a very definitive yes as an answer, of course. Sure, they may be potentially dangerous, and we already have some laws that may address it. So, of course, yeah, let's go ahead and look at those and let's regulate. If you ask economists, then you will have a more reserved attitude towards regulation. Those guys don't really like regulation per se, only if there's a reason to intervene. And so they will ask questions like, okay, so is there a market failure here that I would have to regulate? Do we really need an intervention? And if the answer to those questions is or are yes, then, well, we will go ahead and start looking for a solution. Then ask political scientists. So political science is yet again approaching this question from a different angle, namely, yeah, it's one thing that we make rules, but then how do we get people to accept them? So what are the very complex bargaining and consensus mechanisms that we have to keep in mind, that we have to be careful about in order for our rules to actually be accepted as legitimate? Then if you ask a computer scientist, who are really important in the AI field, obviously, then they will say about regulation at least, well, we know that thing. I didn't sign up for that, it's not my job, don't know, don't care about it much. And by the way, would you please define what you mean by AI, because that's a term that can mean so many different things, and it's a very sloppy definition, so I can't really work with that. Then if you go to humanities and social scientists, then they would look at how any regulation you may issue would affect society, both on an individual level and in terms of social relationships and all. So yet again, very different perspective. Another one are businesses. They will go, oh my God, no, please, no, I don't want any regulation, just more burdens to work around, leave me alone with that. Then the public, on the other hand, will probably be very keen on regulating artificial intelligence, especially for sake of protection from the evil tech firms. That's a very, I don't know, that you hear it a lot nowadays. Then as far as regulators are concerned, these guys are under considerable pressure to do something that actually works because, well, they are the regulators who should solve the problems, not them. So they are like, okay, well, we have to do something here, something that works, possibly, hopefully, but we have to definitely do something. Then politicians, well, they are the cunning ones. I don't know the answer to whether we should regulate or not. Maybe I don't even care that much, but I have to somehow spin it so I get re-elected. And then, of course, there are countries who are competing for superiority in the AI space as well, for various reasons. So this is your team. These are the guys you want to put together in a team and have them work together on solving AI-related questions that affect us all as a society. And this is, as you probably all have some experiences in this direction, extremely hard in practice because these parties are really thinking very differently. It's very hard to even sit them down at a table and make them understand each other. I mean, like maybe they understand the words that come out of your mouth, but if at all, but maybe not even that. And let alone, you know, the actual message that you want to convey or invest the time to understand it. So there are loads of communication problems, and there is very limited knowledge transfer between various disciplines and also stakeholders. And of course, there is a lot of political sensitivities at play, and a lot of ego as well. Not to forget about that one. So that's our starting point when it comes to AI regulation. So it's fair to say that it's a big mess, but we have to do something and we have to start somewhere. So let us now talk a little bit about, and the reason why we should do this is because actually we would all achieve more if working together. So that gets us back to the teamwork thought and team thought, okay? And as the Captain Underpants books would say, remember that now. So this is, I guess, one of my core messages of this talk. We do need to somehow make it work. Okay, so now let us talk a little bit about regulation. Like I said, there are a lot of misconceptions around what regulation is. And these misconceptions differ according to what parties you are talking to. So one thing that people often equate regulation is like rules, law, okay? Most probably law that is binding and is imposed on us by the state. Well, that's part of the truth, but it's, I think, better to think about regulation in terms of a process that involves a lot of different parties, and that is there for the purpose of influencing behavior. And we do that in order to achieve some goal, and well, this goal should be socially optimal. Well, why socially optimal? So who really regulates? That would be a second thing that is good to keep in mind about regulation. So yeah, we would say maybe Parliament regulates, or depending on the country's setup, you know, the organs that are responsible for that, but no, not really. Those are just delegated, like organs with delegated power, and that power comes from society. So you should think about this whole setting in terms of society as a so-called the principle, and that uses several so-called agents to carry out the tasks that need to be carried out. So that by definition means that agents should, at least ideally, serve social interests. So that's why the goal being socially optimal. And so when you want to do your job with several people and you can't do it yourself, then of course you have a problem, namely that person that you asked to do your job may have different interests. And so they may not do quite the thing that you want them to do. And that is referred to as agency problems in the field of economics. And there are lots of those in the field of regulation. And to further complicate the situation, because we don't really know, we can't know all the future possibilities, the states of the world in the future, it is really hard to even define the goal that you want your agent to pursue. So again, quite a messy terrain. Then another thing is that, again, people think about regulation in terms of something that is imposed by the state. this is especially prevalent in industry who really just think about regulation, at least reflexively, as something that is a constraint on their activities and something bad around which they have to work. And so this is this view is a little bit pernicious because it's not in line with the truth, because even though regulation is state-driven, it's not the state that does it in and of itself, because all the modern regulatory issues are so complex that the state neither has the resources nor the expertise to do that alone. And so they are really in need of pulling in people from various sides. That's why all these consultations in modern regulatory practice. And so all these parties actually work together and co-create regulation. And if you are at the table when creating the rules, then obviously you have a say in what these rules may be. And that's an opportunity. And that's something that many firms and other stakeholders don't realize, that yes, there will be a rule that will constrain you in some direction, but you have a say in what those rules should be. And so that is an opportunity that you should not, that should be on your radar. Okay. And then a last thing is that we are very much concerned about actually creating rules, and sometimes not enough about whether people will accept those rules. And well, you all know about rules that are somehow silly and you don't want to follow them because they don't make sense. Well, if you create such rules that people just don't take seriously, then, well, you can't really use them. They are not much work. And so whether your rules are actually accepted or not depends on a couple of factors, including whether, of course, they are somehow furthering the goal that you set out to achieve, aka facilitating the social optimum that we talked about earlier. Then there are also who and what kind of institutional architectures release the rule also matters. So there may be a lot of inefficiencies around, when, for instance, several regulatory authorities are tasked with overlapping tasks and they really contradict with each other, or issue rules that are unclear for stakeholders. So there are a couple of problems there as well. And then, of course, consensus building processes are complex, even within nation states, let alone internationally. And unfortunately, when it comes to AI, we are at the international forum, and so we need to work in international consistent solutions. Okay, so zooming in on a couple of key issues in AI regulations. So the first thing is that AI technologies, well, we can debate how new they are or not, but especially in mainstream knowledge, they qualify as pretty new. And so we don't really understand that much about them. And questions arise on multiple levels. So from the technical, obviously, all the way to various social disciplines that have to say something in this. And so that's just to, spot the problems and let alone solve them. We really need to get together. And as we talked about it earlier, this is tricky in practice. And also because we don't really know what to expect, we don't really know where we want to end up. It's really hard to optimize towards some goal if you can set your goals clearly. Then another thing is that AI has a global impact. And it is extremely fast evolving and extremely transformative, which means it basically turns our lives upside down in every conceivable domain. So even if people don't really feel like learning about this technology or dealing with it at all, you can't really escape it. I mean, you can put your hand in the sand, in the sand, but that will not save you. Not the ostrich, by the way. And then, so we really do need international and consistent solutions. And we'll talk a little bit more on that later. And then there are some pretty serious regulatory governance shortcomings in practice nowadays, which bring the risk of fragmented regulatory regimes. So if you have several actors that have a say in what rules we have, then of course there is more scope for contradiction. And that is, if you are a firm who is active in multiple jurisdictions, for instance, and you have to comply with not just one regime, but maybe 10 or 20 or 30, well, then you need 10 or 20 or 30 or maybe 200 people in your compliance team. Who wants that? Nobody. Yet we have, that's our reality. So it's something where there is scope for improvement. Then another thing which is less clear for academic thinkers or regulators sometimes is that there is a very big difference between devising a rule, which necessarily has to be abstract. There are different levels of abstractness, but you have to be abstract because you're targeting a multitude of stakeholders, and implementing it in practice. If you're sitting in the shoes of a firm who has to comply with those rules. So we will talk a little bit about that too. Okay. Now, another key message is regulation can go really, really wrong. Okay, so it's not always a good thing to do by far. And regulating technological innovation, and because, well, AI is just, you know, one of the most recent waves of technological innovation, but we have been through this a couple of times with more or less success. So I give you just really an example with automation. So, you know, industrial revolutions and all that, we have been through quite a few, and they have improved our lives. Again, we can debate what improvement means. Let's not go there in this particular talk. Let's just say that our welfare has increased by some metric at least. Let's look at labor conditions. That is something that is hard to argue about. But then, okay, we have these improvements, but we also have some new problems with it. So technological unemployment is one example I mentioned. And then I have here economic crisis like the Great Depression, because funnily, the Great Depression went down in history as a financial crisis, but actually it also has some economic roots, and it has to do with technological innovation, which basically disrupted, the short version, it disrupted the agricultural sector, which then caused a downward spiral in the entire economy. And that's why that particular improvement, which started the technological innovation, which started in the agricultural sector, turned out to be at least on a transitional basis, making society worse off rather than better off. So things can go wrong. And that wasn't even regulation at that point. And then, of course, automation also changed us on the way. So maybe our forefathers were really good at handling certain devices that they needed to manually handle, which we would not be able to touch anymore because, you know, those tasks are automated. So entropy of abilities, for instance. And then, of course, the transformation of societies and many other things. Really just a couple of examples, you get the point. And so with AI, it's one form of technological innovation, but a complex one. And as I mentioned, transformative and all that. And so we don't understand it very deeply. So it's really hard to see where it will lead us. Okay. What we know, there is some good news as well. We know some things. We are not entirely useless in this situation. So, and this is a little bit, this guides us into the field of economics now. So in real life at least, markets are virtually never so-called perfectly competitive markets. So you may have heard about our economists saying, well, you don't need to regulate because the market regulates itself, right? I think everybody is familiar with those statements. And well, yes, it's not wrong, but you have to fulfill a couple of assumptions before you can say that this statement applies. And they always forget to say those assumptions. And one of those assumptions is that the markets need to be perfectly competitive, which is not given in real life. So under imperfect conditions, technological innovation does not necessarily make society better off, because there are certain market failures that may actually introduce further distortions and such as aggravating inequalities and many other things. So this thing that we think will improve our societies may not actually end up doing so. So because of these imperfections, market imperfections, how innovation actually is felt by society and who feels the benefits and how exactly is very much determined not just by market forces, but also the so-called market structuring regulatory framework. Now, if regulation plays a role, then we should do it right. That much is clear. But there are a couple of very important criteria that such a regulatory framework must fulfill in order to have a chance to work in the first place. The first thing is that we want innovation, that's good, but we also want safety. So you have a trade-off there. And well, again, as different parties, some will care more about one than the other. So we have to find something that is optimal for society. However, you define optimal for what group. And then the second thing is because technologies, and especially AI, so the more modern we get, the more or the faster the pace of things seems to get. So you need to be flexible. Well, think about regulators in general. How flexible are they really? That's all. So again, scope for improvement. And transparency is important because at least some degree of transparency, because that is helpful to establish trust, both in terms of in the ability of regulators to do the right thing, and also if regulators say, well, we need this technology, we just have to, cage it a little bit or tailor it to our circumstances, then trust in the technology itself. And crucially, if you don't have that trust, then maybe you don't have not maybe, then if people don't trust the technology, then that technology cannot be successfully adopted in society. So then you have a whole different set of problems. Okay, and well, AI is here, and I think it is here to stay, but we can still screw it up with the trust issue. So we have to keep an open eye on that and work on it. Okay. Now, what kind of abilities or knowledge and that do we need to design appropriate regulatory frameworks? So one relatively obvious factor is to be familiar with the technology that you want to regulate, okay? And also on the social side, how does this affect society? What social values? And sometimes it is clear to see that it affects us somehow, but as a regulator, you need to pinpoint your problem. And so it's sometimes hard to pinpoint what social values exactly it affects. And I will give you an example for that in a little while. So one thing that you need to do as a regulator is acquire the necessary technical expertise, which means actually sitting with the technical guys. I'm just saying technical because we could mention computer science, data science, and other fields. So yes, this is not really happening in practice, at least not nearly enough. So that's one of the major problems in the field. Then ethical considerations do play a role. So we are talking about regulation here, but regulation is just a set of minimum standards which flows from social values, which flows from various disciplines, various cultures, and on and on. So these moral values have to inform regulations. And so this is where the social science community can help. We just, from the regulator side, it's you have to see that, well, even though those guys may not be very applied at first sight, they still have something to contribute. And on the side, from the side of our little abstract guys thinking in a corner, they need to know that they actually somehow can approach certain parties and whom to approach in order to contribute. Again, seems trivial, yet it is not in practice. And well, this is a good one. So we have talked about the fact that it's hard to pin down what social values that the technology may impact. And so it's important to find the right metaphor for that, because we, especially the legal community, they work with a lot of, I'm missing the word here. Analogies, exactly. And for that, you need a starting point, okay? And if you choose your starting point wrongly, well, then you may end up at a very wrong place. And so this should give you all this, what I have said so far, should give you like a first insight into why we really need to resort to teamwork here, and how all these different people have something to say and something very important to say. So yes, we really do need to improve in terms of communicating. So on paper, we are pretty good at it. We have all these interdisciplinary seminars and consultation processes, but go in one of those rooms and see what happens. And then you will see that we are, so the aspirations fall very far from the actual outcomes, or rather the other way around. So big gap between those two. Okay, now this is a legal case, and I thought I'd talk about this a little bit because it's a very good example for how that thing with choosing the right metaphor can go wrong, really, really wrong. Okay, and I will also guide you through what happens when you misassess regulatory anomalies. So back in around 1928, there was this gang of liquor traffickers, and they have made some pretty good money on it, but of course at that time it was illegal. So the police had something to say against that, and they just figured out a new way of kind of spying on criminals, which was wiretapping at that time. So they ended up wiretapping their phones. Two important points to note is that the bugs were installed without any physical trespassing in on the criminals' properties. And second, they haven't filed for any warrant for the installing the bugs. Okay, now then, well, it got into court, and it went all the way to appeal, where the Supreme Court had to decide the following questions. The first one was whether wiretapping would have needed a warrant, and if there wasn't any warrant, whether that violated the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And among parentheses, the Fourth Amendment requires a warrant for physical searches and seizures. Okay, so here's your metaphor: physical searches and seizures. And so basically, what it boiled down to is, does wiretapping constitute a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment? And so here's what the court decided. They relied on this very much physical conception of search, rather than kind of a broader understanding of privacy, more general. Okay, and so what they said is that the Fourth Amendment is inapplicable in this particular scenario because there was no physical trespassing, and so wiretapping does not constitute search. Clear enough from a legal perspective. You don't look anywhere else, know, how it impacts the economy, socially, what is privacy, and so on. Then just based on the legal provisions, this is a clear-cut conclusion. And so they also concluded that there was no need for a warrant and everything was okay like this, because, well, we don't really have a privacy breach here, at least not as severe as a physical search and seizure. I think most of us would disagree with that assessment nowadays. And there was one visionary person in that court who also did it. So Justice Brandeis submitted a dissenting opinion, and he was complaining about the fact that the court failed to grasp wiretapping's potential threats. And so basically what happened, the court applied the wrong metaphor as in physical, conception of privacy and to wiretapping. And what happened is that at that time, they failed to protect the critically important value of privacy. And so his point was that the Fourth Amendment would not or should not be restricted to physical searches and seizures, but more focused on the value that we are protecting, which is privacy. And well, of course, he warned that future technologies might present even bigger threats. And well, he was right, because here it is with AI. So we have a couple of even more serious threats here. And so the aftermath is also important, because there was the mistake there, right, in this decision. And what happened afterwards was that U.S. search and seizure law gradually adopted Brandeis' position, which is good, so far so good. But let's see what happens exactly. So 6 years after the court decision, they enacted a new law which declared wiretapping a federal crime. But then they needed 39 years until the case law adopted the same principle. Okay, and so they basically moved from physical search and seizures from reasonably expected privacy, the protection of reasonably expected privacy. And then now, of course, this is the current basis of modern Fourth Amendment law, but we needed almost 40 years for that. So then, what are some lessons here that we can learn from this case? The first one is, if you, as a regulator, and think about regulators broadly, okay? So here it was a court, legal community, anybody who is saying that if you misunderstand a new technology, how it works, or also what kind of values it may threaten, and how exactly, then you may cause some very serious trouble and damage, okay, for society. The law must adapt. Now, that is something that seems so straightforward, yet if you talk about how to regulate AI or what happens if AI technologies do not conform with some current legal provisions, not one, not two, but many people would, from the legal community at least, argue that, well, if it doesn't conform to the law, then we should ban it. So, no, not necessarily. That may be a valid conclusion, but not based on the fact that it doesn't conform to the law. So the law needs to adapt if there is a good reason to. And we can preserve our normative values in law because that helps us to generate better legal answers, but we need to adapt, okay? So things are not carved in stone. And because law has critical impact on all of our lives, we have a responsibility to do it right, emphasis on responsibility. And so one more thing, maybe we should do it a little faster next time and not ruminate 39 years on such a question, okay? Because, well, with AI, we're already lagging behind, which is normal in a way, but please, not so much. Okay, so now let's turn to a couple of more current challenges, and I just have two examples here from my recent research. I'm not even going to go deep into it, just maybe just mention it. So the first thing that we have looked into is there is a lot of there is a lot of discussion in standard setting in the standard setting community, for instance, about how to deal with data fusion. So that's when you merge several data sets. And it is a fact, and you can mathematically actually prove it, that if you merge several data sets and then process it by an AI system, not necessarily. So the processing by the AI system is just a fact of life. But if you merge several data sets, then the information that you can gather from those data sets separately is not just, if you merge them, you don't just get 2 times that, but more. So you can get some extra information out of that. And sometimes, for instance, the Cambridge Analytica scandal is one example where they started with collecting information in at least partially anonymous form. And then through merging data sets and other processing steps, some of that anonymized data became personal information or personally identifiable information. So personal data is the term that is more pervasively used in the EU, whereas personally identifiable information is more pervasive in the US and other parts of the world. So, and we started to think about, okay, if so privacy laws currently only apply if personal data or PII is in question, not if you're dealing with anonymous information. But this differentiation between, so if anonymous information suddenly becomes personal data and vice versa, so it's kind of a fluid thing, they change. And because you may start with anonymous information, which then turns into personal data, then does it really make sense to trigger privacy laws only if you have personal information or personal data? So that's a question that we answer in the negative and say that maybe we should protect all pieces of information on person or all data. Of course, how the implementation will be a harder nut to crack, but at least in principle. So that is one conclusion that we think may be worth thinking about based on some technical challenges. Okay, another one is liability. So we talk a lot about what happens if an AI system, for instance, an AV self-driving car hits a pedestrian and that who is liable. Okay, so the designer of the algorithm, the designer of the car, the driver in the car, and other parties maybe. And so liability is a key issue. And then very often people resort to so-called product liabilities, whereby it's not dogmatically not 100% correct, but they say, well, we don't care what you've done because you made this car and it cause some damage, you're liable. But this is, I mean, this is okay for a victim, right? Because if you get hit by the car, then it's a reassuring thought that somebody will be held liable. But what about people who may buy that car? What about people who are producing that car? What about the people who produce the algorithms and the AI systems that car uses? So will they be happy if they could not have foreseen some mistake or failure or anything, and yet they are held liable? Well, it's not a very good situation for them. So from a risk assessment perspective, they probably will say, well, no, I'm not going to develop that thing, or no, I'm not going to buy that car. And then there is an innovation that society may miss out on just because of this question. And of course, it's important, and I'm not saying there should not be liability, but we have a problem there. And the core problem from a legal perspective is foreseeability, that every form of liability, whether criminal or civil, and the different forms would then require some form of foreseeability. And I'm not going to delve into legal definitions here. Think of foreseeability in terms of some ability to control what happens, okay? So if you have zero control over what happens, then you should not be liable, right? If you can control it somehow, then you should do your best to make sure that nothing bad happens. And we show, like in a paper, we showed that there is at least one sort of AI model, machine learning model, namely deep neural nets, who do not fulfill this foreseeability requirement. And so it's just one example. There may be others. We just show that, well, guys, you have a problem here. So and of course, so the solution to say, well, we don't care about that problem, then we just make someone liable. As I've shown it to you, that may not be the best solution, because from an innovation perspective and a whole societal perspective. And so we have proposed a couple of solutions now to handle this issue. But the important point is that we started from a very technical issue and went all the way to a regulatory issue. And I'm saying all this because I think that if we want to successfully tackle most of the AI-related problems nowadays, then it starts from the technical areas, okay? So you need some technical expertise and an interdisciplinary expertise, because you not just need to know that, well, neural networks are somehow opaque, okay? But you also have to know that, well, legally that may present a problem here. So already 2 disciplines. And then let's get economics into the picture with all those points that I've mentioned around innovation and stifling innovation. And then I'm sure if I sat down with philosophers or others, then they would have some other things to add to this debate, okay? So even to spot the threat, you need this sort of collaboration. Gets us back again to teamwork. And then if you want to effectively control these things, then you need to go international, okay? So you can't say, well, I'm in Germany, so I'm going to regulate this within Germany. Not gonna work. You may end up with a regulation. If other people don't have that sort of regulation, then competitive disadvantage for the country. And you know all the arguments against these sorts of things. There are many reasons why that can't really work well. So you have to get together with other countries and devise a solution that people widely agree on. Good luck with that. And then, of course, you also need a multi-stakeholder approach, because so involving not just academics or just regulators, because just regulators would be the national or the rational, but the more obvious thing that people think about. But you need academics in the debate and also industry, because well, if it is up to either academia or academic or government, then it would take years, right? We will never get it done, because we think about all the little angles and less about what is feasible in practice. And industry has a lot to contribute on that front, and they have some very pragmatic solutions which can solve problems. Maybe not the best solution, but a solution that can jumpstart us, and then we can take it from there. So, and of course, resources and all that. All right, so teamwork. Hopefully, now we have talked like quite a bit about that, and it is very clear for everybody there. Okay, a second point I wanted to tackle was this whole thing, I have mentioned on several occasions that we need to think internationally, and we need to somehow devise international consistent regulatory approaches. But why? So why wouldn't it work if I just said, let's do it in one country? And that is leads us into the domain of political science and international relations, in particular, among others. So, at a very basic level, the scope of regulatory coordination should always match the reach of the impact of your regulations, so-called externalities. And why? The why or the answer has to do something with ensuring efficient control. Consider the following situation. If you have some national policies and in an uncoordinated manner, then they will almost inevitably conflict with each other. Now, if country 1A says 1 and country B says 2, and then you have to, I don't know, exist in both countries, then you have a problem. And so that may lead to tensions. And also the other thing is, one country cannot really control what happens outside of borders. And so this inability to control for what you've done is also something that may upset others that are affected by what you have done but can't do much about it either. And also another thing is that, yes, if there are some regulations perceived as burdensome in some countries in in an attempt to solve some problem, and other countries take the easy way out. Oh, we don't regulate, just go with innovation and let's see where it take us. Then there may be scope for regulatory arbitrage and also a competition between countries. I don't have to say really a lot about that because we see that happening every day. Now, this whole thing and these sorts of things complicate cross-border relations and interactions. So again, take the example of a firm that is a multinational firm and exists in, or operates in several countries. Those guys have some serious compliance burdens to deal with. And then if you have fragmented regulation, then you also have another problem, namely, you can't really, in a crisis situation, for instance, you can't act swiftly and coordinate, like you just, you are there and trying to figure out what to do with all these different regimes. A very good example is the most recent global financial crisis. Okay, so there we had a major problem adapting and finding strategies, and not least due to divergences in regulatory stances. And look where it led us, and especially in Europe, it was really hardcore crisis. And so, because again, AI has a global impact, and because of all these issues, we do need international and consistent regulation. Now, what are regulatory governance frameworks? And governance, that's again a word that is used in many different meanings, and so it's virtually impossible to pin it down. But for, at least for the purposes of regulation and for this stuff, it is the organizational structure. Think of it in terms of organizational structure. Okay, so we are the rules are clear that regulation produces some rules, but now we are talking about the parties who work together in producing these rules. Okay. And all the processes that they follow and all these different authorities and agencies and everything. And so governance quality also matters because it affects the efficiency of regulation. Architectural problems are one example that can create very serious inefficiencies, okay? And this is something that is not specific to AI, it's really in all fields. And if you have several regulators in one field and their mandate overlaps, then you have these sorts of problems and many others. Another thing is that people need to be able to trust in both the quality of regulation and it's like it has to be credible what regulators do. And for that, you need a certain transparency, a certain level of consensus on, well, this is what we really want to do here. And some accountability for mistakes, of course. And if governance is somehow wrong, so for instance, you have a totally incompetent authority or any other problem, then two things will happen. First, you issue your nice new norms and or rules, and nobody will care about them. So people will just not accept them as legitimate, they will just reject them. And so regulation would be there to, you know, impact behavior, as we talked about it earlier, but this goal will never happen, okay? So we will not be able to achieve it if nobody follows them. And of course, if there is one regulatory regime that is very much not in line with somebody else's ideas about that particular issue area, and think, for instance, stance of the US against or versus the stance of the EU versus the stance of China, for instance, in just AI regulation or any other field really, then they will find ways to contest each other's regimes. So you will end up with these nice little or bigger debates around around how to do these things and contesting and conflicting regimes. Again, not really a good way to go. And so actually figuring out governance should be a core political priority. But of course, real life is more about putting out very urgent fires rather than we don't always have the luxury of approaching fields in a nice systematic way. And so a really streamlined governance landscape in the AI looks like this. And these are just the most important parties, okay? So the OECD is a core, I mean, I have the pleasure of working together with several of these organizations, and they all have some really nice and exciting and useful things that they're working on. Unfortunately, they all have their own babies, which means that it's, again, you know, with fragmentation, it evokes some problems. So the OECD, one of the most well-known or influential pieces of, let's call it regulation at this point, are the OECD AI principles, which have been taken over by many other instruments and adopted by many countries. So really very influential principles. And the OECD is working together with actually all these parties basically to develop rules that are, you know, closing in on it's not standards per se, but they take pains at finding consensus and bringing out rules that have consensus behind them or backed by consensus. The European Commission's most well-known piece of AI regulation is the upcoming AI Act, and currently in proposal form, and it will be binding very soon. Then the Council of Europe is currently working on a convention of a sort, so a legally binding instrument that would go beyond the ambit of Europe, and so that it would be a first binding convention on AI regulation. And well, it's interesting. It will take some years until that endeavor is achieved, but it's an interesting line of work as well. UNESCO has a slightly different focus. They have brought out a set of ethics recommendations, and they are very much focusing on, you know, bringing these AI-related issues together with the SDGs, obviously, and a couple of other things. Now, GPAI on the bottom and also the World Economic Forum are two more parties to mention. So GPAI is a relatively new organization. It's a French-Canadian initiative, or has been. Now there are more countries in it, and they are on the more applied end of things. Their scope is very much under formation, so it remains to be seen where they end up. But for now, they have a multitude of interesting projects. And then the World Economic Forum is an interesting grouping because it's an NGO actually, as opposed to the other organizations which are intergovernmental in nature. But they have quite a bit of power behind them as well, and they work together on also some applied projects in partnership with either big firms or countries. So they also contribute significantly to the policy field. And then I also have corporate best practice and national regulators because, well, self-regulation, national regulators, of course, there are international initiatives and there are many national initiatives. Everybody's trying to figure out how to best regulate AI. And corporate best practices are very important because it's a form of self-regulation. due to the fact that regulation is, as always, lagging behind, stakeholders have to figure out a way in the interim on how to deal with these issues. And so that's when these best practices come in. And I left out the middle line. So those are the standard setting agents or agencies. So that's the standard setting community. ISO is, well, global in scope. IEEE is a professional organization, and SANSANAC is the European standardization, one of or two of the European standardization bodies. And so if you want to, and I will talk a little bit more about this later, but so standardization is really important. It's a first step in concretizing highly abstract regulatory rules. So, and there's a lot going on in the standard setting community. So unfortunately, most of those documents are not publicly available. But at least if you are sitting in an industry, like, you know, in a firm or something, then you should keep an eye out for standards, because those are the things that give you a lot more idea about how to actually comply with these rules that are coming out, whether binding or not. Now, this leads me to the last point that I wanted to talk about today, namely the issue of implementation. So we have these highly abstract policies, but if you are a programmer or a product developer in a tech firm, for instance, then what do you do with these things? Will you sit down and read policies? Unlikely. Not part of your work description, not what you signed up for. You wouldn't understand half of it, because who understands the language unless they have to? So what do we do there? And one thing that is not so obvious is that how you frame the entire issue matters a lot, because it will, so stakeholders' attitude will depend a lot on how you frame things. So if you mention the word regulation for industry, then they usually turn around and run away as fast as they can, because they don't want to hear anything about it. But well, if they have to comply, then okay, they have to listen. And so you can, sometimes you hear, so there are a couple of things, you know, bias, transparency, and many others that you can sometimes are spoken of in terms of ethical issues, and sometimes as policy or regulatory issues. So which one is it, you would ask, right? And so the one explanation at least is that these issues first emerged in the technical communities, because those guys started to think about, okay, well, we are developing this technology, it is now coming out of the labs and affecting society, so maybe we should think about what those effects might be. And then as the technologies are now getting more and more pervasive, and we have all sorts of encounters and problems and benefits and all different things, now the policymaking community has picked up on these things. And so the once ethical issues actually de facto became policy or regulatory issues. I'm kind of using policy and regulation interchangeably. Sorry for the international relations community, or, you know, communities that make clear distinctions between them. For the purposes of this talk, it's not really necessary. Okay, and so the next question is whether this whole thing is just mere semantics, so I don't care, and or I shouldn't even care, or not. And so content-wise, if you're talking about bias issues, then it doesn't really matter whether you frame it as ethics or policy, because it's the same thing. But there is a major difference, or there are major differences in terms of, or between non-binding ethical principles and binding legal rules, okay? Because in the latter case, you have a potential compliance issue as a stakeholder. So when you're talking to firms, then they often say, well, AI ethics, I know it's really important on a virtuous, you know, level, but I don't have the resources for that right now. So do I really get any kinds of ROI out of it, or do I have any risks that I need to really be aware of? Because unless that's the case, that's not a priority right now. And it's understandable, because, you know, especially if you're not a big firm, you do not have the resources. So why should you care about it? But if you turn this around and say, well, okay, whether these rules are binding or not, don't just write down ethics and you know, just put it off the table. Because even if the rules are non-binding, your customers may hold you to it. So you may lose customers, and you don't want to do that. That's a risk, that's a business risk. Or you put a lot of money into product development without taking into account these so-called ethical or policy principles. You end up with a product, then there is a regulation that becomes binding, and that's a waste of money. So again, yet another risk factor. And so you can, you know, depending on whom you are talking to, you have to make your point very differently. That's again something that is really important in practice communication. Now, and the last kind of thing that I wanted to talk about is these different levels of abstraction when it comes to actually complying with rules. So you have at a very high level policy or regulatory principles, and examples are the OECD AI principles or the AI Act, but there are many others. And so there is this one principle, transparency/explainability, and it's known to every one of us who is working in the field, right? So, but of course, AI systems need to be transparent. But what is transparency? What is explainability? There are no clear definitions of that, right? And so we get away with that at a high abstract level because nobody really asks us about, okay, so define it now for me, please. But when it comes to compliance and put yourself into the shoes of the product development team or the CEO of a firm who has to decide over product development issues, you can't use that thing, you know, it's not useful for you at all. So what do? Where do you turn? Yeah, you can self-regulate, for which you will be sped up on, but you have to find some solutions because you have to say something to your product development teams. Now, standardization is perhaps one level lower, so they have a lot more details, and at that level, you can get away with not defining terms clearly. You actually need to. So for instance, funny thing, in the ISO, there has been a debate over the relationship and definition of explainability, interpretability, and transparency for a long time. And there is, there is no consensus so far. We will actually reach consensus, but yeah, defining terms is not so easy. And especially because you have different usages in different policy documents, but even in technical literature. So if you read machine learning literature, whereby these terms originated at one point, then you will find explainability and interpretability and transparency, all three terms. And sometimes they are overlapping, sometimes they are clearly defined, but then those definitions may contrast with some others. And so you have to find something, when you are standardizing, you have to find something that people will also interpret and understand the same way. So if a machine learning specialist reads something around interpretability, then they may understand it differently if you're not really clear about your definition. And then this technical guy has to be able to talk to the CEO or the regulator, you know, so it's really hard in practice. And in standards, you have a lot of how-to rules as well, so kind of a checklist, what organizations need to do in order to actually comply with this sort of provision. So for instance, with explainability or transparency, let's talk about transparency. So there is such a thing as organizational transparency, and then you will have some rules around what an organization needs to do, what sort of roles to enact, what sort of processes. In terms of AI models, what might you have to, what kind of boxes you have to check in order to be transparent. And it's good, it's really good, but it's still not enough for you to comply with it, at least not straightforwardly. Not least because these documents are several tens of pages, and again, invest the time to invest to read several of these documents to check for inconsistencies and even know which documents to read. So then, compliance by stakeholders, again, by companies, for instance, let's take to these examples. What happens there is hopefully a policy person or ethics person. I'm just calling it like this very unprofessionally to make a point that these roles are not even necessarily defined well. And this particular point, definition doesn't matter. It's just so there is a person who deals with that. And then that person needs to have a familiarity with the policy and standardization landscape, which is hard enough, even if you work in these gremium. So actually, for those of us who work in there, even we are like, oh my God, what do I need to know? What is all that? And then that's that new standard. And then those people are coming up with something. So it's really hard to keep track of those changes, let alone to someone who's not very familiar. And then with these things. And then this person needs to sit down with the C-suite to make the firm understand how and why this is important to the firm. And then you don't have hours to present. You have maybe 30 seconds, you have a few minutes. If you're lucky, you have maybe, I don't know, half an hour or so, but you have to make your point and very clearly. Now, hopefully, they will understand that they need to go in such and such directions. Then you have to sit down with the technical teams and product development teams and make them understand what these terms mean. So if you develop a conversational agent, for instance, okay, transparency, what is that? What do I do? Tell me what to code for, what product features I should or should not have. And so you have to customize, so make people understand what's at stake, what they need to do. You have to customize these already quite detailed standards to the particular needs of the company. You know, what product features we are talking about, what standards relates to those, what standard is not so relevant, and so on. And then, so what you need to do is getting all these ethical/policy aspects really deeply integrated into company processes and the overall company culture. So that's when you sit down, if most of the AI developers have agile development processes. So you would sit down with the teams and product owners and teams and say, okay, well, you have such and such and such aspects that you have to integrate in your sprints and all the processes that you have to go through. And then they need to understand, they need to kind of, put it in the backlog and then work with it. And you also need to, in organizational culture, so you also need to concentrate on that everybody knows where their role is, how they can contribute, how they can work together. Easy to say, extremely hard to do in practice. So, and that's where I would end this discussion. So it's an extremely hard thing. I guess that's my final bottom line. And so this is why I think, and I like to close with this slide often. When you think about AI regulation, and so we are in this, the thing, you can think of it in terms of a crossroads. So we are society, we have to figure out what we want to do with these things. And so taking it to the extremes, we may end up, so AI is either something really good that happens to us, and then we may end up automating everything and not having to work more than 2 hours a day. Cool world, right? You can do your hobbies. Or we kind of end up in an Orwellian dystopia, surveillance state and all that. Well, we don't want that, okay? And so it's our responsibility to do it right. So with great powers come great responsibilities, as we know from Spider-Man, very important part of literature. And so, we have to figure out how we do this right. And so ultimately what I think is, AI is not the problem, we humans are. And with that, thank you for your attention.
So, you can moderate yourself, right? Or do you want me to moderate? Do you want me to keep names? Otherwise,
yeah, that's okay.
No? Okay.
Yes, the room is small, so.
Good.
Thanks for that. Really high level talk. It brought us through the whole situation of regulating AI, which I think was really helpful. I have not worked with these organizations that you're talking about, although I'm aware of their work. I think this allows me to be a little bit less pragmatic, let's say, so I'll be a little bit annoying right now. And one of the words that you kept using is innovation, and how we use it in such a utopian sense, positive. And I think you talked about missing out on innovation because of regulation done correctly, or establishing a constraint that might be too much for a company to deal with. But I think that it's kind of weird to use innovation like that. I think we could easily just say dodged innovation. You know, used autonomous cars. I would say innovation or regulation hopefully helps us dodge this terrible innovation. But I think less controversially, most of the innovation in AI has been targeted advertising and marketing, stuff that we could all do without, it seems, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm worried that innovation is just used too positively here, and that there's no room for just saying, well, what if we just don't want that innovation? And then the second big concern that I had was your desire for this broad, you're worried about fragmentation and regulation. You know, the EU can't do one thing and the US another, and all these things because it poses these burdens on the companies and you know, just, you know, hurt innovation again or something like that. But I think if the EU was to wait for even the US, you know, I'm just going to bracket China, as we're never going to work with them on this. But if we were to just take the US situation, which has a broken political system and so much power in Silicon Valley, we'll just never regulate anything. We will be waiting forever. And so I think it makes sense. I mean, maybe you can explain why it doesn't make sense that the EU protect its citizens while we wait for other countries to do something, anything, so that we can have so that we don't have the problems of broken election systems, democracy, and attack, and stuff like that. Anyway, those are my two big concerns, but again, I'm trying to be not pragmatic, so thanks.
No, I mean, thanks for raising those questions. So on your first one with innovation, I was trying to make the point that innovation is not necessarily good. So we have talked about the fact that under ideal circumstances, and that you can show that in economics, there are models for that, that under ideal circumstances, innovation is something that makes society better off. But in real life, that's not like that. And so that's one insight, that when you have the option to do some innovation, you don't necessarily have to take it. So I completely agree with you. Not all innovation is good, but you have to be, when you measure pros and cons, you have to look at quite a few factors, economic factors, various social factors, regulatory issues, to decide, okay, is it good for somebody? And I'm saying, okay, society, but society again, do you mean a country? Do you mean a region? Do you mean globally? And people are different, and countries have different economic situations. And so it's really hard to find an optimum that is a global optimum, so to say. And at this point, I'm just talking about mathematical modeling, not politics and not real life, okay? So it's, when I'm saying optimum, I'm talking about what would be the optimal trajectory, which we can, at least to some extent, model. And I think that's one part of the question, to go into the theory and try to model what would be the optimal situation here. And then, and that relates to your second question, whether the EU should wait for the US and China and so, and obviously no. But so that is something that, yeah, we should do something, even if it's, we try to get close to the optimal as close as possible, okay? But real life is very different from a theoretical optimum. So the luxury of us scientists is to at least think about what would be optimal. And as a regulator, I think you should also kind of have a knowledge around that. And what you can actually put in place in real life, well, that's usually a compromise. And you can just hope that it gets as close as possible to your optimum. Okay, so I think we are on the same page. It's just people are coming from very different perspectives in this whole AI field. And it's a really good thing, but we need to be able to channel these ideas and perspectives in a constructive manner. Otherwise, we end up with just ignoring each other, or worse yet, offending each other.
Okay. So thank you for your talk. It was very informative. I have two questions. So the first question, I mean, correct, the external auditor question. So you said at the beginning, if you ask the question, should AI be regulated, then we will have the more regulation enthusiastic, let's say those would be the ethicists and the lawyer will say, yes, let's regulate as much as we can. And the regulation skeptics, so maybe software developers or marketing people would say, no, we don't need this really, let's just set the problem. So when we have a conversation together, when we have a table with all stakeholders, and then we have this conversation. But the question is, who should put this table together? And it struck me when you talk about the non-state-driven regulation. So here we have, we can say maybe infinite possible scenarios, but let's take 3: US, China, and Europe. So US and China are always the opposite poles, and Europe in the middle. So you will have hyperstatalism and hyperliberalism, and in the middle you trying to find a compromise. Exactly. I mean, also Heidegger was taking this situation with Russia. It was just a scenario.
It sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar. And anyway, so my question would be something like, how much liberalism can we afford to maintain the process ethical? Because if we get too liberal, those assembling the stakeholders table might be more balanced toward let's regulate as less as possible. And if we get too so authoritarian statalist, then of course there will be a regulation, but it will be deeply biased. So this is maybe a complex question with many layers, but I hope I expressed it with sufficient clarity. The second question is a call for more information if you are able to disclose it, because you mentioned at least 2 times the transparency and explainability problem, and also in my actual research I'm faced with this. So when lawyers call for explainability and transparency, computer scientists say, yes, very nice, but the point of machine learning is that it's not transparent. So if you maybe can tell about your experience with these different stakeholders and maybe a possible solution. I'm discussing with mathematicians in those days, because they are saying, okay, maybe there are some aspects of the process that may be made transparent, but neural networks and machine learning are in principle not transparent, and this is the interesting thing about them. So how is this?
Okay, so lots of things. So the first question was around who should be at the table and how much pragmatism or liberalism can we allow ourselves. In an ideal world, again, we would have a regulator that listens to all the relevant pieces of information and achieves complete information and then makes a rational decision over that, right? That would be the ideal situation. This will never happen. So the political reality is again, well, there are certain political dynamics and power constellations that will crucially determine the outcomes of these negotiations. That's the reality. And then when it comes to sitting down to table, well, I mentioned non-state actors because states are really just one sort of participants, but you have corporations, you have civil society, you have really academics, you have labor unions. So you have so many different parties that represent the interests of different groupings. And we do have those people at the table. So for instance, when we're developing the AI principles, I was a member of the expert group who developed it. And we had all those parties at the table. And it was an interesting discussion, an initial one. That was, the beginning of all these things. And you can only try your best. So it will never be the ideal optimum, but that's what we can do. And we should nevertheless try to get as close as possible. You won't get a really satisfactory answer to this question. to your second point, which was around this, yeah, whole explainability issue and everything. So in standardization, at least, those discussions are underway, and we currently are developing techniques, and so we are kind of putting aside the definition right now, that we are working on that too, but in the meantime we are trying to gather various techniques for, you know, for explaining models and interpretability and all those different things. Even though you will never be able to completely explain or make it transparent, use whatever words you want, a deep neural net in every aspect of it. It doesn't mean that you can't settle on a notion of explainability that works for society. So it's not hopeless, okay? So you don't need to necessarily, depending on who you are. So if you are a user, if you are just a normal person who uses some system, okay? You use Siri, for instance, or anything, then you will not necessarily want to invest the time to understand all the complexities of machine learning and how a deep learning, a deep neural net works, or other machine learning models for that matter. If you are an AI developer, for instance, who develops those systems, then you will have a pretty good understanding. It's still not complete because there is a, you know, really very real technical limit to what you can explain. But you will have a pretty good idea of what happens and why, for troubleshooting purposes, for audit, accountability, and all those purposes. If you are a regulator, then you will have to have some, again, a different type of explainability. Depending on, or another classification, whether you are a technically literate, highly literate person, an expert in machine learning, for instance, and the other end of the spectrum, you're a lay person, you will need different sorts of explanations. And I would make a comparison to the financial system. So there are all these complex financial products, and in many countries, there are laws that prescribe that you have to have some sort of, you know, disclosure around those products, and they have to be layperson accessible and easily understandable. So I think, in pragmatically, I think we will probably go down a similar path in AI regulation as well. It is a very problematic topic because you will, if you, for instance, explain it with layman terms and necessarily in a simplified manner, then you can pretty much say what you want, because those persons will not understand. They will not call you out if you are even lying, because they don't have the expertise. So you can use and exploit that situation. And on the other hand, it's also conceivable that we will end up with two parallel explanations, one for layman, and then the layman can get their, not lawyer this time, but their little pocket computer scientist, and they will ask them, okay, here's a technical explanation for a computer scientist who can then advise the layperson. So there are many conceivable outcomes here. It's very early discussions, and you just have to give it time, I think. An important thing is that I caution everybody against is, don't create yet another baby, okay, here with all these rules and everything. So take what's out there, and there are more or less influential pieces of policy or regulation, even including corporate best practices under that banner now, but don't invent something completely new and conflicting. So that would be my bottom, I think.
Thank you, Olivia, for your presentation. I found it very informative, and I really appreciate what you do, because I believe in regulation. But I have a concern. In Silicon Valley, the mantra for almost every company is get it out there before the competition does, and then iterate. So they are very comfortable getting something out that is incomplete, they know that it has a bug that might break, that may not function all the way, because the idea is just be there first for the consumer, right where the consumer is ready to use it and buy it, and then iterate and make it better, which is why we're constantly having updates with our software, by the way. We, in some sense, need to study everything that's going on in some sense with the goal of trying to get it right, trying to get regulation right. And the problem, though, is the very thing that we talked about in the last presentation, right? This idea that we'll never have a full representation of everything. We'll never get everything that we need to in the complexity of regulation, right, from all the different perspectives. We need, in some sense, to also produce and iterate. However, if we put something out there and then constantly iterate it, then we have this issue of trust. Because, well, why should we trust you? You're just going to change it, so I'm going to go ahead and break the law, or not doing it right now. On the other hand, these iterations, with each iteration, especially in device technology, changes the need for new regulation. And so in some sense, we do have to almost do all the research, but then be ready to constantly prepare. And I don't see us right now having that same model, because we're not driven by the need to survive by getting it out there first. So I wanted to know what you think about that. And secondly, I'd like to recommend to you to go ahead and patent the phrase pocket computer scientist. It sounds like some application or device that is coming up soon.
Thank you for that. I would like to defend industry a little bit, because they, so everybody tends to blame, big tech and tech firms for all the evil that they put in the world. But we have to also think about the fact that there is a very real market demand for those things. So, and who should serve that demand if they are not the ones? So, it's what I'm driving at is, it's of course not black and white, and it's by the same way. It's also the same with the car industry as well. So don't buy a new one because of the same problems. And actually, that's the recommendation that you would get from any head of a car company. So just because something doesn't work perfectly does not mean that you can't trust it at all. I think if you have this knowledge that the higher you market that product matters a lot. So if you say, well, here it is, it's new and it works perfectly, you can perfectly trust it, but you don't, and actually it's a lie because you don't know that, as you said. And then something happens, that is something that destroys trust. If on the other hand, you're transparent about, okay, well, there it is, it's more than a proof of concept. We brought something out, but we have a couple of questions, and so you may have such risks with this product, and you are transparent about that. Then you as a buyer will see, okay, I have a certain risk. I make a decision whether or not I take on that risk, and then I can, if something happens, then it was still within that, the predefined risk potential. And of course, then you would say, well, unless you regulate it and give firms an imperative to provide such disclosure, they won't do it, which is probably true. But that's where regulators can kind of step in and incite more disclosure regulation. They should just know what to ask for, what information to ask for, which is why they would ideally need to be familiar with the technology. But so even if there are some daunting challenges, disclosure goes a long way. So that's one very pragmatic solution that I can think of off the top of my head. And I also don't think that we should really blame Silicon Valley for everything, because, and I'm not, I'm aware of the discussions, but it's not all evil, really. So think about the fact that if you are asked about, many people at least, if you're asked about whether or not you want personalized services or recommendations, or things brought to your house without having everything comfortably, and who would say no? Many people would say, oh yeah, give it to me, yeah, more of it. And then you basically opt into these things and you want them. And it's not governments who are going to bring in that service, it's tech firms. And so we need them. And if we work together and we sit down again, the regulators with the tech firms, and for instance, standardization is also a forum where this happens, but there are many others. So we sit down at a table and we just discuss, okay, what's feasible, what's pragmatic, what can be expected, because we don't want, and it's always a trade-off, and it's always about finding the right balance. So and you have to work your hardest to do that. It's never going to be perfect, but then we started to fly a couple of years back, and we crashed and crashed and crashed, or look at NASA experiments with the first space shuttles and rockets and all that. It's ridiculous. So, and we could have given up, not trusting the technology, but we didn't. So, and we knew the risks and everything. As long as we are kind of transparent and about what we are doing, I think we can go forward. And of course, again, it's an idealized statement, but that is something along the lines of what we are. I think that's a path that if we follow that, then I think that will lead us somewhere that's feasible and good for us.
Well, thank you very much, Olivia.